You've been involved with politics for a number of years, working with candidates, advocating for candidates, especially progressive candidates, working with Ralph Nader's campaign, bringing him here a few times and backing his campaign. So probably people wonder, have you ever run for political office before?
Just like all the other candidates who are running, no, I've never held political office before, but the primary difference would be that although I've been very politically active, it hasn't made me any money. And I think that for the most part, we're looking at a race here that for me is about principle. It's about that I was born in the district and I live here and I work here and I employ people here. And I'm not one to yell carpetbagger, and I'm not going to. I actually think that the two mainstream candidates, and certainly Matt Doheny, all have a claim to the area. Matt in particular, and he plays hockey. So even though we disagree, I'm sure, about almost everything, I would have to respect the fact that he probably is a lot better at stick handling than I've ever been. Essentially, I think that we need to be wary, though, as voters, of people buying seats, and this happens on a regular basis whether people are from in your district or not. And for me, it's much less a question of geography than it is a question of monetary resource. Are we going to continue to allow people from the upper middle class, people from the ruling class, to represent us in Washington, D.C.? Are we going to continue to allow people to represent us from outside of our districts? Congress is supposed to be a group of people who are all really unique and bringing very unique perspectives to Washington, D.C., so they can all be shared. We can kind of figure out what the United States is supposed to look like because of how different it all is. I think, unfortunately, what Congress has become is a huge number of representatives who are there because they've been paid to be there. And those people are not being paid by workers to be there. Post-NAFTA and GATT, we are a country of workers, and the middle class is just a synonym for deluded people who don't realize their alarm clocks are just a little bit more expensive than the ones in the working class. It's why I call myself a worker. I work 50 to 60 hours a week in my business. I make 40 hours a week worth of pay. Don't tell the Department of Labor; they'd be upset, I'm sure. But I don't feel like at any point in time being a business owner is allowing me the absence of conscience to put my alarm clock away and let other people do the work for me. And I think quite frequently people who are running for Congress don't really have to work. They feel like this is a career they're interested in. I'm politically involved because there are lots of issues that are only going to be resolved at the federal level. And when we look at the main ones, which right now certainly are single-payer health care and why we do not have it, 2/3 of Americans want it and know what it is when surveys are conducted. We know that our healthcare system is terribly broken. We know that the ACA is basically a bailout for the insurance industry. That's criminal. And I'm not for its repeal. I'm for taking the age of Medicare, being the eligible age at 65, and reducing it to 0. There's been a Senate bill, H.R. 676, that's been out there for a number of years. The reason why it lacks traction is that we're not electing senators who will support it, and I think we need to do that.
You would argue Obamacare probably only covers a certain number of uninsured as it is. Medicare is expanded, but you still have probably 30-some million Americans who are still without health insurance, even after Obamacare, the number of states that have opted out not to expand their Medicare programs.
I would actually argue something slightly different, and that is that I spent my school years in Ottawa, Ontario, from the time I was 7 years old until I was about 19. And then I returned to live here, although I'd spent my summers on my father's farm in Wilton. When I came back here to live, I lost an important thing, and that was my health insurance. I grew up with the terrible Canadian system that we all have heard so much about, the long lines and the socialized mechanism and the death lists. Canadian healthcare is by result about 50% more efficient than the American system, and it's half as expensive. And that's been my experience of it, and that was all of my friends and family's experience of it too. Can you find Canadians to complain about healthcare? Of course you can, because it is not a perfect system. But it's a system that doesn't have profit inherent. We often compare socialized medicine to Medicare in this country, which is a terrible mistake because you're dealing with people who are over 65. And it's a very simple mistake that those with insurance often make. You know, they say, oh, Medicare is terrible. Well, are you going to refuse it when you turn 65, though? I don't know any who have. I know that improved, expanded Medicare for all is basically what the Canadian system is, and it's forced funding of a federal plan that includes everyone and has no profit involved. I think the efficiencies that are built into a system like that when it comes to purchasing are very well demonstrated right here in my part of the congressional district. Glens Falls Hospital is considered a system of economic development, and it's treated as such by the founding fathers and the people who run our town. And it is a big employer, there's no question about that. 10 miles south, in an equally tiny pocket of population in Saratoga Springs, is another hospital very similar to Glens Falls Hospital, performing the same functions. And the reason is we have privatized healthcare. These mechanisms have set up, and they are engaging in the process of collecting public funds to build and expand and employ. To use a Monty Python quote, we pay for the machine that goes bing. You know, we are paying Big Pharma, we are paying for their research at our public universities. We are paying hideous amounts of profit when it comes to what insurance companies are being made to pay to mechanisms like this hospital. And yet at the end of the day, no real assessment's being made as to whether or not we need two hospitals of this size 10 miles away from each other. And as a result, I think the Canadian system can look at those things and say, maybe there should just be one hospital equidistant between those two. And we could save a lot of money by not running two hospitals. So if you're on a remote fishing island off the coast of Prince Edward Island, guess what? You're not going to have a hospital because 40 people live there. But we will fly a helicopter out to get you if you fall off a cliff. You know, we've realized it's cheaper. These are the kinds of decisions that can't be made when you are running the hospital, when the hospital is yours, when it's a for-profit mechanism that you are responsible for. As a business owner, I understand that. And I'm a business owner without health insurance, and that was a conscious decision I made 4 years ago when health insurance became so expensive that I couldn't afford any longer to participate in a program with my employees. I was paying half of their premiums. Knowing what the Canadian system was like, I just could not believe that our prices continued to go up and up and up when service actually was continuing to decline. Deductibles were getting higher and higher. The amount you were going to pay as a copay on your doctor's visits or for pharmaceuticals was ridiculous. And at some point, we have to recognize that I'm not a pariah and my workers are not pariahs because public money is paying 52 cents of every dollar spent on healthcare in this country right now. You know, I have people who might be state workers or in the upper middle class or academics say to me, well, you don't pay for my healthcare. It's true, but I'm building the hospital that you go to. That's what they're failing to understand. I'm supporting you when you are eligible for Medicare, just as you are supporting me. That public money is more than enough to cover everyone in the country with a single payer system. And 38 of those systems exist around the world that are rated better than ours. And again, I see no reason to be spending all that extra money. It's a savings all the way around. So that's a huge issue for me. I can't resolve that by running for mayor. Or maybe I could in a bigger town, but not this one. Another issue is certainly for me the livable wage. I'm expected to support corporate welfare, as are my workers. And a great example locally is General Electric. General Electric has been denoted a too big to fail by Congress. I think there are 4 other companies that have received this designation. And they are allowed to borrow money from the Federal Reserve at 0% interest under a mechanism called, I think, GE Capital. Maybe that's justifiable if they're actually promoting and increasing the number of jobs we have in the Adirondack Park or nationally. What GE is doing right here in Fort Edward is they're pulling out and they're closing down a plant that employs 200 union workers so they can leave and go to a right-to-work state, Florida in this case. If they weren't making $1.2 billion in profit currently, and if I wasn't carrying them on my back, maybe that wouldn't be the end of the world, that we're participating in this global kind of economic slavery, this neo-slavery that means workers are supposed to fight each other to death over a $10 an hour job. The Democratic answer to that is we won't leave things alone. we will raise the minimum wage federally to $9 or $10 an hour. And although I'm on board with raising the minimum wage, I want to raise it to a livable wage, and that's probably by most standards above $15 an hour at this point. And probably not even that low an increase when you get into the metropolitan centers. It costs a lot more to live than we are paying people. As a small businessman, I'm not paying people that money. My wait staff make minimum wage, real minimum wage, $8 an hour. Most restaurants pay $3 to $4 an hour for people who are working as wait staff. I'm coming to a point where my own progressive beliefs and thought processes and principles about what we should pay people aren't allowing me to run a profitable business. They're allowing me to run a business that's at a standstill. That's not good enough. We all work very hard. We're all good people. We deserve to make a living. The fact that I have to help General Electric or Walmart or McDonald's cover their payroll is not just unjust, it's again criminal. And I don't think it's enough to say, let's get these poor people $10 an hour. All you're doing then is removing us from Medicaid. You're removing us from getting food benefits of any kind or rent assistance. We wouldn't need any of those things if the minimum wage was a livable wage. And it's been proven over and over again in most studies that have been done that if you give workers money, they will spend it immediately. They're not going to save it. This is not the 1950s. We will go to our local retail mechanism or our local restaurant and we'll blow the money. This helps the economy.
Of course, the critics would chime in, even small businesses, that it would hurt small businesses and it would kill creating jobs if you paid wages that high.
Well, and I think the whole idea of, if any of those people actually Googled just the words prevailing wage and looked at what it's done in metropolitan centers where they have decided that paying a union wage, even though they are not paying union contractors, makes sense. If they looked at states that have already adopted higher minimum wages and looked at what that has meant for the local economies, they would remember the immortal words of Henry Ford. He was questioned about why he was paying his assembly line workers so much money to make the Model T. And he, yes, anti-Semitic, and yes, he's crazy because he built marble palaces in the middle of the Amazon, but he also understood as a robber baron that if I don't pay my workers enough money, they can't afford to buy my cars. Globalization has meant that our robber barons aren't our robber barons anymore. They've gone overseas. They're multinational now. And they don't see themselves as American. They're citizens of the world. So when they are stealing lots of money from us at the public coffer in respending it, they're not even respending it here. Workers do. So I just say, why don't we give them some of the money? Why don't we give us some of our money back? It's an easy way to do it without necessarily changing tax codes or getting into long battles with people who like to hide their money in Costa Rica.
Livable wage, single payer health care. What are some of the other priority issues for you that have basically made up your mind to run?
I think another very important one for me is probably, without question, the subsidies of our farms in New York State in particular, and upstate New York primarily. We've been doing farmers markets as a bread bakery since the very beginning 26 years ago. And the farm markets in the city have grown in leaps and bounds, but when you look at the farm markets up here in the park, the number of farms who are sending produce down to the markets in New York City is amazing. So we obviously are being, we are obviously part of an explosion of real food. These are sustainable farms, they're family farms, they're organic farms. And what I've also seen grow along with that explosion within the farmers markets is an explosion of regulation and an explosion of subsidizing of corporate agribusiness that dwarfs anything I've seen before in my lifetime. We centralized farming in New York State as of the 1950s. We started to push forward with the idea that instead of the ideal little farm with the red barn and the cow and the chickens and the vegetable garden, that Farmer Brown was going to have 1,000 milking head and was going to live as part of an unsustainable system that impoverishes him, but also impoverishes his workers. And it makes him a tool of the banking industry that is supporting him. It also provides us with milk that is at its basis not good for us anymore. Not just BGH and BST certainly, but actually what's being done to the land. when it comes to fertilizing and pesticides, the way in which hay and soy is being grown. I think it's really important that we look at the Farm Bill, which is something Democrats and Republicans always seem to be able to agree on ultimately in Congress.
I don't know. A couple of extra years this time around.
Well, they like to have their politics, you know, the theater of politics at that federal level. We like to watch a good battle on TV. But much like with single payer, when all the dust settles out of, you know, that 1,000-page bill, how many things actually benefit the small farmer who is variegated or sustainable? I see the need to subsidize. If we're going to subsidize anything about farming, it should certainly not be corporate agribusiness. We shouldn't be subsidizing ADM and Monsanto and ConAgra. We should be subsidizing the growth of more small family farms. It's not well understood, I think, in the group of consumers who will be voting in this election, that more than 50% of the farms, I think it's 52% in New York State, are actually dairy farms. What we also don't know, and we should know it, is that out of those farms, every year the attrition, the number of farmers that are lost to that process, is growing in leaps and bounds. And the reason for that, as George Pataki said in his State of the State, I think it was his second term, is it's okay, because we're only losing the farmers. We're not losing the farmland. I think it's really important for us to understand what that means, that our governance is looking at this as the bigger these farms get, the more efficient they are when it comes to bringing money in and to growing food that isn't sustainable and to making food that most of us don't seem to want to eat, the better they are. And the more we should be subsidizing them. And I think the adverse is true. We should be going out of our way as a government, and this is a federal government problem. It shouldn't be a New York State issue. We should be looking at the federal government subsidizing the rebirth of the family farm, not just in New York State, and not just in upstate New York, but all across the country. It's interesting to me that when it comes to wheat, 100 years ago, New York State grew almost all of the wheat for all of New England. And we've lost that understanding. Most people you talk to nowadays who eat food, and that's all of us, believe that you can't grow wheat in New York State. And in fact, that was a popular belief on my own part, on the part of many farmers 20 years ago.
20 years ago, farmers now, some up in Essex County are growing wheat.
We actually are buying about a quarter of our wheat right now from Watertown, from a place called North Country Farms. As it turns out, there have been about 4,000 or 5,000 acres of wheat being grown out there for years, but it's been grown as a commodity. And about 5 or 6 years ago, the group of farmers who is in ownership of that series of farms decided that rather than sell that to these huge commercial mills like Cargill or ConAgra, why not mill it right here in New York State and sell it within New York State? That's part of the New York State Pride program too, that again, there are programs the government has manifested that are wonderful and that are helping to market and produce and get New York State products distributed to others, not just in New York, but around the country. Federal money needs to be spent on doing that, and there needs to be a much bigger grasp of that we need to decentralize our farming. We centralized it. A lot of that had to do with that we had the railroads and we wanted to export products elsewhere. I think we now need to decentralize it. We need to understand that the world is not the same place it was in the 1950s. We're not in the McCarthy era anymore. We're not still suffering through the Cold War, although there are those who would argue we still are, I suppose. And perhaps it's time for us to have smaller microsystems or to develop deep economy, as Bill McKibben would say. And I've seen that happen with farmers markets. People can talk about political ideology day and night, but if you actually look at a farmer's market today and look at where it was 10 years ago, almost every single market I'm familiar with is grown by leaps and bounds. And it's a wonderful thing to see that we are voting with our dollars there. I think we need to vote with our dollars elsewhere. Elections are a huge part of that. We need to stop voting for candidates that are being put into office by corporate agribusiness. I think Barack Obama is actually very good proof of that. We need to stop picking and choosing which corporate lobby group it's okay for our mainstream candidates to be represented by. How about it's not okay if any of them are? How about if we actually elect real human beings who work for a living to office, and the gentleman farmer goes to DC for 2 years or 4 years and then comes back to run their bakery or their farm or their legal practice. I believe that if we as voters envision that we have the power to do it again. You know, democracy is in our hands, but we need to have the vision to know that we can do it. We have to stop pretending that the roadblocks that are being put up that are really a form of propaganda, we have to stop pretending they're real. They're not. All we have to do is vote for a candidate that is other, and we'll be doing the right thing.
You brought up a couple of environmental issues.
Sure.
Usually, often, Green Party candidate environmental issues are huge.
Right.
You know, your potential primary opponent, Donald Hasig,
right.
Many of his issues are primarily environmental issues,
right.
pollutants and carcinogens and things like that.
Don actually, I think, classifies himself as a food safety activist and a cancer awareness activist. One of the interesting battles that's taken place within the Green Party that I've been a witness to and a participant in is the kind of activist versus politician battle. And to me, the Green Party is a political party. It was founded by activists, and there are many activists within it, but it was with the understanding that we need to get into the political arena. Don is someone who I don't know. We've had several conversations since this race has begun, and I've learned more about him. I actually have respect for his activism, but I don't feel that he actually is someone who is going to go to Washington, D.C. and represent us. One of the main reasons is that he is fairly single issue. And I really think that an ability to put all of the issues together and to understand how they all work in play is really important. And I'm not saying I'm the only human being who has that capacity by any means. I think lots of people do. But I think it's very unique to the Green Party that we tend to run candidates who are activists first and foremost. I believe that actually, I just found out from the Board of Elections today that Mr. Hasig has not actually been accepted as a candidate on the ballot yet, or at all. So I don't think they accepted his petitions because he mailed them in.
He does have an appeal process that may take a few weeks to play
That's correct.
out. So.
That's correct. And we, along with a number of other candidates, have been challenged as well. There's a general challenge at the moment. They have till Monday to put in a specific challenge and state what the issue was. We have twice the number of signatures we need, so we're pretty confident.
If you both do get on the ballot, you were just talking about the differences between the two of you.
Right.
While Donald Hasig tends to focus on many of the environmental issues, food safety issues, you tend to have a broader Green Party agenda.
I think I was just talking to one of my friends about this yesterday. That I a long time ago had a discussion, probably when I was about 14 or 15 years old, with my mother about plastic bags, and she's massively into the idea of personal responsibility, and I am too. But I love the fact that she was doing that, and at the same time, the intellectual side of me was saying, but how effective is it to wash and reuse your plastic bags when I'll bet you $1 million that the plastics lobby is just going to figure out a way to make a thicker gauge of plastic to wrap one more thing out of if you really are effective as an individual at doing that. And I know I'm right about that. I mean, the bottom line is if there is enough petroleum to produce plastic with, they're going to make us use it. It's a structural issue. So we can look at environmentalism as an activist pursuit, or I can say, why don't we legislate it instead? And I think that when you look at activism versus politics, looking at what just happened in San Francisco is important. We're banning plastic water bottles with water in them. I think that's brilliant. It hasn't happened in New York, and as a businessman, I'm still selling plastic water bottles with water in them, but they're Saratoga water. They're being produced by a friend of mine. There are two brothers who own the company, and it's local. It's 8 miles away from us. I believe that you have to, I'd like to use the words, embrace the hypocrisy. We live in the United States. Once you're born here and you're a citizen, you are to some degree living in the empire. And to pretend that you do no damage is naive at best. It's a very idealistic thing to pretend that. None of us are pure. So I am aware that I'm not pure. I drive a Ford F-150 pickup truck, and I'm a green. I also cycle 3,000 miles a year. Do we balance, the 17 miles per gallon with the, I don't know, 1,000 miles per gallon on my bike? I don't know. I don't know how exactly you figure that out. Do we figure out that a Prius is 10 times the carbon footprint of my truck, even though it could get 40 or 50 miles to the gallon when running properly? The batteries are terribly unsafe for the environment. And it was made in Japan by non-union labor, whereas my truck was made in the United States by union labor. American consumers are forced to make all these choices that really are, it's very twisted. And I think that the federal government has a lot of power to help regulate industries so that we are making smart choices and decisions when we produce goods. The problem is, again, that these free trade agreements that have nothing to do with free trade, they have to do with socialized trade for the multinationals and the ruling class, have allowed them to start the process of turning the United States into a third world country. And this is a level at which I think very much right-wing voters, the Libertarians, the Tea Party, are very much in agreement with the Greens. You know, we're not on a different page. We might be on a different page about what you should do about it. But it's as when I talk to friends of mine who are libertarian, Eric Sunwall, who's the Libertarian state co-chair. He and I have massive disagreements about a number of things, but I love and respect the guy. And we can have these conversations, and he always makes me think, and I believe I always make him think too. I always say to him, it's a really nice idea that we go back to the country doctor and nobody has to pay for medicine and we'll trade bananas or chickens, you know. But what happens when I get cancer? What happens when I break my leg? You know, is there going to be enough security in that system? And can we go from a system that is entirely built around the idea of corporate welfare for the health insurance lobbies and all of a sudden turn it all off to go back to the country doctor? And I say to him, on a strategic level, the only way you could ever affect that is to do the Medicare bill the way I'm talking about. I see that as a really simple answer, with something we can all get behind that shuts off the profit and the corporate welfare mechanism involved in healthcare and gives us a rational answer. If you then want to lobby for, we've removed the profit, now here's a way to also not mandate that people carry that insurance or participate in paying for it, I would certainly say, well then let's open it up. Let's say that if you don't want to have Medicare for all, then you don't have to have it and you don't have to pay the taxes for it. That's fine. You know, but your medical care becomes your own issue. I really believe there would be an infinitesimally small number of people in the country who would participate in that because they would see very quickly that it works. So I think that you know, back to your original question, which was, what are the primary differences on an environmental level, really, between Don Haseeg and myself? It would be that I'm not perhaps as outspoken about fracking or about Keystone XL as Don may be. You know, it doesn't mean I'm not aware that oil trains are coming down our railway through the Adirondack Park and by all these small towns, and that they're trying to set a refinery up in Albany. It seems to be quite obvious that that is what's afoot. I'm not for or against the idea of us using fossil fuels as an ideology. I think that's a mistake. I am for us developing as much clean and sustainable energy as we can. And by that, I'm not using a Democratic buzzword at all, clean coal or clean nuclear. I'm saying if we're going to subsidize GE and if we're going to subsidize, you know, the tar sands oil that's very much dirty, and I mean, Canada's already had this argument with itself, which is why they want to sell this to us. Why don't we very simply look at solar and wind? Why don't we look at individual residential answers for these questions? Why don't we look at a green jobs program, much like Hallie Hawkins and Ralph Nader have both put forward before, which allows for a subsidized jobs program that is not make work, that's like WPA, where we actually are looking at repairing infrastructure, where we're actually looking at, instead of having an IDA zone in Glens Falls, that's going to subsidize businesses that are already here and already profitable. Why don't we instead look at setting up businesses that aren't here yet? A good example of how we subvert that process of using common sense and rational thought is AMD, you know, Global Foundries in Malta. When this was set up, I was aghast. $1.2 billion in taxpayer funds being spent to subsidize the Silicon Valley North that they envisioned for upstate New York. These are private companies that are for profit coming into the area, promising us 800 jobs. You know, in what mathematical world are 800 jobs in the United States of America in a factory worth $1.2 billion of taxpayer money? And the answer is, well, they could get a better deal somewhere else. And I say, well, let them take it. Because we don't need unsustainable industry. We don't need industry that leaves Superfund sites. We don't need industry that leaves the area and creates an employment void and leaves families without any means of income either. And that's what huge corporate mechanisms will do every single time. They don't provide us with jobs. And that's always how we balance economic development.
The fear is that they only stay a certain amount of time and then they're gone and they take
Without
advantage
question.
of...
And maybe General Electric, which I keep noting is a bad example because they've stayed for a very long time. But certainly when you again look at how many times they come back to the trough, it really, again, does not take much of a mathematical ability to figure out that it's not a job creator. To have these huge monolithic corporations in our backyard and pretend that they actually are going to provide us with a living, because they're not.
Another big issue, obviously, for the 21st District, the border security,
sure,
border trade, and that goes hand in hand with national security, defense. Obviously, Fort Drum, a huge part of the 21st, probably the largest employer, at least in that part of the 21st District. How do you look at the military and defense and border security?
I'm a very simple person when it comes to the military, and I'm probably not very atypically green. I'm a big believer not only in the Second Amendment, but I'm a big believer in that most of the gun laws that have changed federal course or state course, like the SAFE Act in this country, are actually built around hysteria. And quite frequently, the school shootings issue to me is a huge one. That we are crafting gun legislation around the idea that most murders in this country are committed by people with automatic weapons, when in fact 97% of them are committed with handguns. And we seem to do very little to protect people who are living in the inner cities from this handgun homicide issue. It's an epidemic. But if middle-class children are killed in an environment that is much more prominent and much more horrific because of the number of people killed, we react. I don't think we react with a great amount of intelligence. When it comes to military issues, I look at it the same way that most Greens are pacifists. I'm a hockey player, a bad one, but I'm a hockey player nonetheless, and I love to watch a good hockey fight. I am a worker. I do physical work for a living. I am from a family of veterans. My father and uncle were both veterans. I do believe in public service. And I also think that when we have only 450,000 soldiers employed at this given point in time, that's not really on a per capita level that many of the people living within our population. It isn't an issue of that the underpaid soldier is the problem. That's not our military budget. Our military budget is that, I just read an article in the Economist magazine not long ago in which they were talking about this amazing little device that was made on a 3D printer by two guys from the University of Virginia. And they called themselves the MITRE Corporation. And they produced basically a spy plane that is $3,000 using an Android phone and this 3D printer. It's of course electric and it's remote control, and it doesn't have the range that a B-2 would have, but it doesn't cost $2.8 billion either. This is the kind of corporate welfare we can do without. One of the things that was amazing about the peace movement of the years since the first Persian Gulf War was Ben Cohen latched onto this study. And I remember very clearly getting one of his peace pens and following through with that and eventually looking it up on the internet to see what he was talking about with the military budget. And one of the things he was saying was if we just took the 15% that most military experts, many of them retired generals who are lobbying for the defense industry, are telling us we could easily shave from the budget without losing any of what we have, any of the capacity we already have. That 15% could be used for X, Y, and Z. The thing is that X, Y, and Z, when you're looking at the military budget, are things like free college tuition and health care for everybody. Food, so that those who are poor don't have to beg. That's kind of a big deal. Why are we building in this excess and these kickbacks into all these military contracts? So my position is a little bit more cautious than we can eliminate defense entirely. I'm not for that by any means, but I'm a big believer in the idea that defense belongs here in the United States. It doesn't belong abroad. We have just shy of 200 military bases, I believe, built around the world. This is the empire. If there is not a better example that we've become the Roman Empire, that we have military bases all over the world, many of which are not welcome in the places they are. And we are equally removing the manufacturing of any goods from within our borders. I mean, this is where the decline and fall of the Roman Empire occurred. We can learn from that. If we want to be this peaceful empire that understands its position, kind of in a post-World War II way, Americans seem to believe in the inherent goodness of America, that we were going to go out there and regulate the rest of the world, but we weren't going to be corrupted by it the way all the other empires have been. We have been corrupted by it. And the fact that we have become a militaristic empire without any manufacturing is proof of that to me. So I think we need to return to a sense of economic isolationism and military isolationism that will allow us to rebuild ourselves anew. I think a very important part of my campaign is about fairness. I think we need to re-envision everything as if we're kids. How would we divvy this all up so it's fair? And I don't think many kids would say, oh, well, we need to build military bases in Saudi Arabia because there's oil there that we need, or that we want to sell to China. Or it would be nice to build a natural gas pipeline and Unical is going to give me $100,000 as campaign donations if we do it. That's not how children think. And I'm not saying all kids are fair. I've read Lord of the Flies. I'm just saying I think that we don't do things in a very democratic way. And it's time for us to start. When it comes to defending our border, I'm a little bit, well, it's an understatement to say I'm a little bit disenchanted with what's happened at the Canadian border. But when we look at Paul Bremer and what he did in Ottawa, after leaving Iraq, he basically set up an embassy in Ottawa, Ontario that looks like something out of Cold War Russia. The thing is massive and it overshadows the Byward Market, which is this very beautiful, sunny, idyllic part of Ottawa. And Ottawa is a very beautiful city and it's very quiet. It's on the Ottawa River. The Byward Market is one of the most beautiful parts of it. And for the American Embassy to have put this very grave, McCarthy-era type mechanism in it is just letting them know. It's letting Canadians know that we own you. That's what we're doing elsewhere in the world too. It's just places like Canada are the last places to see it. We don't need to protect ourselves from Canadians, just like we don't need to protect ourselves from Mexicans. Canadians don't want to come here, for one thing, unless it's to visit when they're on vacation. And Mexicans are only coming here because they need to work. And we have allowed, through the drug war and through the control of exportation of goods and importation of goods, to create an economy in Mexico that is unsustainable for the average worker there. We're responsible for that. So to pretend that there's some type of crisis that exists with Mexican laborers coming into the country illegally to steal our jobs is preposterous to me.
Along those lines, should more be done up here for the farmers that really count on that Mexican labor, the farm labor? That's really become important to them in the past few years. Also, the apple growers certainly count on that. A lot was in the immigration bill that's still waiting to see if that ever passes.
I think
but there
a
were
few of the problems with the Senate immigration bill, one of them in particular is just this idea that there is a path for amnesty, but it's 13 years long. And the reality is many of the people who are migrant laborers traveling from the South to work here don't want citizenship. They would love to be able to work in their own countries and make a living and actually live with their families, which I think most human beings want. We all know this as fellow human beings. But we've, again, through intervention, economically and militarily, we've created inhospitable climes for them. When we signed NAFTA and GATT, the giant sucking sound that Perot talked about is very real. And I think that when we look at the number of factories that went to the maquiladoros almost immediately after NAFTA was signed in that year, And we set up all this terribly, for lack of a better word, it's almost a tyrannical mechanism. You have all these peasants living in Mexico, you know, growing 300 different kinds of corn and living off the land. And you then have, let's take a snapshot 40 years later. Now you're looking at those peasants aren't allowed to live on their land anymore. It's been taken over by all these conglomerates. If you try to organize a union, you'll be shot, you know, and left in a ditch by the side of the road, and nobody will investigate it. The drug war is going on, and you've got armed cartels fighting each other on the streets. And, you know, how can any of us envision living in a world like that? Those people need to feed their kids. That's why they're coming here. You know, they're not evil. They're not trying to do something that is wrong. They're human beings. And I don't care whether they speak Spanish or English or whether they're speaking Dutch. It's kind of irrelevant. We are supposed to be we're supposed to be a country that embraces those from all over the world, you know, and the immigrant classes and the slaves built our country. You know, my Italian immigrants and the Irish immigrants and the slaves who were brought here against their will are the people who built all these public institutions, you know, that we have all across the country. To pretend that Mexican labor is picking our food, whether it be apples in New York State or whether it be lettuce or broccoli in California, is kind of irrelevant. And I think that it does boil down again to market price. It's a really simple issue, that if we were paying the farmer enough money for what they are producing, rather than trying to create through a system of centralized volume a manufacturing base through farming that makes food a commodity, then they could afford to pay their laborers what those laborers are worth. And maybe Americans would want those jobs. Maybe we'd be willing to do that work instead of allowing them to be taken by migrant laborers at a lesser rate. When you look at sweatshops and when you look at factory work being done by illegal aliens in our country, most of it is being done at rates that are also illegal. And the corporate mechanisms that are fueling these sweatshops and factories are in league to some degree with the government. You know, we've seen the documentaries about these people coming from South America and Mexico. And it's quite obvious that when they are deporting people, you know, that they are doing so in a kind of almost a cynical way, in which they are making sure that they're not deporting enough of the workers at any given time that it's going to interfere with production. You know, it's on my part, I really feel like immigration policy needs to be recrafted around the idea that we're closing our borders down to protect ourselves from something. I mean, what is it we're protecting ourselves from? We say terrorism, but the Patriot Act has made me feel just as insecure as anybody who's frightened of terrorism. I'm frightened of my own government in the same way that people are afraid of terrorists, and I shouldn't be. None of us should be. Our government is doing things that are completely illegal and criminal at the federal level. You need look no further than the NSA to understand that our government is spying on all of us all the time now. They have the digital capacity to spy on us 24 hours a day and to warehouse all that information and to come back at us later and say, like they did to Scott Ritter, pardon me, you're a pedophile. You know, you are a UN's weapons inspector and you're a Marine and you're a Republican, but now that you're an ardent critic of the Bush administration, you're also somebody who wants to meet young children in public and have sex with them.
Bernie Sanders is obviously a good example of an independent who's been elected to the House of Representatives and then the Senate. But there are those that probably wonder, is a Green Party candidate, a third-party candidate, a wasted vote? What clout would you possibly have in Washington that you could make a difference?
You know what's very interesting to me is that Aaron Wolf came to visit Glens Falls, and I had not been able to reach out to him and get a reply, much like the rest of the media too, in the initial month or month and a half when he had announced his run. So I was eager to meet him and to speak with him even for a brief period of time, and primarily because I want to believe that there's somebody out there running as a corporate party candidate who is principled and who actually will be an advocate and will fight for us. But my own belief, based on how the Democrats have vilified a friend and hero of mine, Ralph Nader, is that they won't ever do that. They are always going to be cautious. They're always going to caucus together. They're always going to say $9 an hour is enough. Let's advocate for that. And I think Aaron is a really nice guy. He seems very sincere. He's also going to go to Washington and do what he's told to do. I didn't see any fire at all. And that's because he hasn't been in the mines. And I not only have been in the mines, but I'm still in them. And when I say that I want to represent workers, I mean everybody in the working and middle class. I don't believe any of the other candidates intend to represent you at all. I really believe that when you look at going to Washington, D.C. as a meaningful experience for a Democrat or Republican, to me that's preposterous. You know, that you're going to go to D.C. and you're going to do what your party tells you to do, or they won't give you any money and they'll make sure you get shut out of the next race. They're the ones who are irrelevant. How a voter could make a big difference in CD21 is by voting for somebody who actually works for a living, you know, and has to. Not somebody who is living off a trust fund, not somebody who's got so much money in the bank or so much wealth accumulated from their parents or their great-grandparents that they're doing this race as kind of a hobby. You know, this has to be somebody who wants to advocate for you. I look at it like I probably don't agree with every single one of the 700 and some odd thousand voters who live in this district on a number of issues. That's okay, because I'm not representing my viewpoint when I go to Washington. What I'm going to do is there will be votes that I have to take based on Democrat or Republican bills. And honestly, for the most part, if anyone's really worried about how I would vote on any of them, I would just ask you this question. As a voter, name one piece of legislation Congress has put forward in the last 40 years, 46 years, in my lifetime, that benefited you as a worker. Now, all I'm going to say to you is what I will do if I'm in Congress is inspire other voters around the country to vote for other Greens and other Libertarians and other independents. And we won't any longer have a Congress entirely made up of corporate lobbyists and their puppets. And that's how we're going to steal our democratic republic back from the corporate powers that have just been handed the McCutcheon decision. I mean, Citizens United and McCutcheon, to me, as a cynical human being, are kind of irrelevant. The ruling class and corporations have been running the world since time immemorial. Whether the Supreme Court agrees or disagrees with it, it's kind of irrelevant. But, you know, it's icing on the cake for some progressives and some radicals who feel, you know, this is really just too much. And I say, well, if it's too much, do something about it. Stop electing Democrats and stop electing Republicans, because they will never advocate for clean elections and fair campaigns. They will never, ever advocate for fair ballot access for candidates who are running who are sincere and principled, ever. It's never going to happen. You know, show me a world in which it's different from that. Show me the history of those candidates advocating for these things. I've never seen it.
So you think Washington could use a few libertarians and Greens in the mix?
I think they could use a majority of them, actually, and I think that it's just like everything else. I believe, I think really what the Iroquois did about the 7 generations, that if you are not looking at a number of generations ahead of you to affect positive change, then you aren't thinking properly at all. Not as a human being, not as a member of the human species.
And we mentioned the Democrats, so we brought them up. Obviously, there will be a number unhappy to have a Green Party candidate in the race. True, for a couple of election cycles now, the Green Party candidate pulled maybe 1 or 2% of the vote, but there's probably concerns that you might pull more than that, and obviously they worry about what impact you'll have on this election in this district where it's such a close race the past 3 election cycles, where just a few thousand votes have separated the two candidates.
I think if they're truly worried about somebody impacting the race, they might want to talk to Matt Doheny. That's the only reason why a Democrat would ever win in this gerrymandered district, is that the Republicans are splitting their vote. I mean, this is child's play. It's not.
And you had a moderate Democrat running the past 3 times, Bill Owens.
I look at it like there are a lot of people actually who I know who will tell us that Bill Owens is a moderate Democrat. I don't even know what that means anymore. I mean, the political language and the labels that we apply to people, again, almost become irrelevant to me. I really want to know, is he a friend of the worker? And all I know is when it comes to health care, he's not, because he voted for the ACA. And when it comes to a livable wage, he's not. He's not a friend of any worker I know. So he can be as progressive and as quiet, closeted politics as he wants to be. When it comes to actually manifesting a role as a congressperson, I see in Aaron Wolf the same person I see in Bill Owens. That's exactly what Aaron's going to do too. He'll make a great movie about it, I bet, while he's doing it. That'll be the only difference. You know, and he might go to fewer chamber mixers, and I don't think he probably golfs as much. You know, I say with a smile. You can be a good person and be caught up within two-party politics for sure. I know plenty of Democrats and Republicans I have huge amounts of respect for. Democracy for America, Howard Dean's group, meets here in my cafe, you know, the first Wednesday of every month. I don't agree with anything they're doing strategically. I think that it's, on some levels, it's anti-radical and it's anti-progressive to work within the Democratic Party. But I respect the fact that they don't agree with me about that. And they won't support me in this race. You know, I don't come to their meetings. I just believe in democracy. I believe we should have democratic process and discussion. There should be debate and conversation and discourse. I think we all need to keep learning all of the time. And I think when it comes to looking at a political race, like I am hurting someone else's chances, then we're just talking about it as a race. And I love the Irish word for running for office, and it's standing. I'm standing for office. It's a very European way of describing it. Malachi McCourt, who ran for governor as a Green, originally, you know, put that bug in my ear. I was not familiar with that term, and then I read about it. It's exactly what I'm doing. I'm standing for office. I am making a political stand. There are things that are wrong in the country that we could resolve if we chose to, and step one is to stop electing people who aren't going to do them. You know, Aaron Wolf is one of those people. So I absolutely look at it like in this district where Don Hasig, in the last congressional election, he was polling 6 to 8%. That's not a small amount. In fact, it's big enough that you could make the argument that Aaron Wolf should probably drop out of the race 2 weeks before and endorse me, because I will actually fight for the things he says he is for, quietly inside the closet. But when it comes to actually running for Congress, he can't say that because he wants to get a crossover and get some Republican votes. When he goes to Congress as a junior congressman, the reality is he's going to have no impact whatsoever. He's just one of 535 people who don't make any difference, who are doing what their corporate lobbyists and their national party tell them to. And I don't believe Aaron's going to be different than that. Matt Doheny probably would be different than that. But I don't agree with him about most of his platform. And I don't believe that somebody who, you know, worked for Deutsche Bank is really going to be somebody who represents me as a worker. I don't believe somebody who sells off assets and unemploys people for a living is a businessman either. I think that's the upside down pyramid we've seen a million times over when it comes to who we call a business person or not. I'm a business person and I'm a worker. I run a business, I employ people, and I don't ask for public money in doing it. That's different when you get into the corporate mechanisms we like to call business nowadays, or that business students are being taught about. When it comes to Elise Stefanik, I think you're talking about a huge amount of inexperience simply because of her age. I went on her website to look at what some of her issues are, and I have to say that, you know, although we do not have a fully formed platform yet for our own campaign, I would expect somebody who's been campaigning for a full year, according to her, to have far more information available to me as a voter. And I almost think that, again, somebody from the Paul Ryan White House who doesn't live in the district telling me that she's come here to run to represent me as a worker, it's got to be some kind of a cruel joke as well. You know, I want a worker to represent me in Congress. You know, at the moment, the only person in the race who is a worker is me.